On this episode of Beyond the Art, we sit down with Petala Ironcloud, a Lakota writer and cultural critic, examining where art, media, technology, and Indigenous sovereignty intersect. From shaping public discourse to helping establish the first American Indian cultural district in the United States, Petala challenges how stories are told, who tells them, and who benefits. His work invites us to look closely, not just at art, but at the systems that frame it. This is Beyond the Art. Well, Petala, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to speak with you both.
Oh, it's great to have you here. I wanted to ask you, you write at the intersection of art, culture, technology, and politics. What pulled you into this space, and what keeps you there?
I have a sort of serious answer and like a not so serious answer, so I'm gonna go with a not serious one.
Go for it.
I wanted to, I have a background in textiles, and I wanted to get back to that for really years. I couldn't bring any of my equipment with me after I left high school, to go to college in Santa Cruz. So I never had a studio space, and I got to New York, and it's even less accessible to have a space like that in some ways, just with the cost of real estate. So I figured writing is way cheaper than paying rent for a studio because cloud storage is only $10 a month. So that's why I decided to become a writer.
A lot easier, condensed.
Yeah. But so that's my unserious answer. I think the more serious one is that what I noticed immediately after moving here is that there's this sort of native art renaissance happening here, and really very few people documenting it in a consistent way. And I felt like amplifying what I was seeing was really important, especially as much like on the broadest scale possible. So I've noticed a lot of art writers focus on like these small niche art magazines, which seem cool, a Spike art magazine, a Metropolis, whatever. But we're already so niche and like under visible that I felt it was really important for me to push my way into these broader kind of publications with like a real national or international audience. So that's been kind of my focus, and I'm really inspired too to get back to my own practice, and I hope that other native artists are as well. Many people who I've met here have found their way here and like real careers in art rather unexpectedly. So it's been I think that's certainly a model for other people who think like, oh, how do I get to New York? How do I get a career like this? It's really just sort of showing up and being fearless about, I guess, putting yourself out there. And I think that works for the artists that I've kind of learned and read about, and in my own approach to like placing stories.
Mm-hmm. When did you first realize that writing could be a form of intervention, not just commentary, but actually actionable?
That's a good question. I think it was probably just looking at the ways that people write about Native American art. You quickly notice that the art writers that are left, because the people, like to say that the art critic or the critic in general has sort of died in the sort of media landscape. They often write from a really kind of ill-informed and often like demeaning kind of register about Native artists. If you read, for example, this is a more recent example and happened kind of after I'd been writing for a while, but if you read the review of Jeffrey Gibson's Facade at the Met that was put up by the New York Times, there's a number of animal figures that Jeffrey felt sort of communicated to a non-native and native audience kind of some spiritual lessons about like how Native people interact with our environments and other species and what we learn from them. And the reviewer said that this reminded them of a Beatrice Potter novel, and that it was whimsical, and they went on to sort of talk about it in pretty childish terms, and I felt like that was really doing a disservice to this work, which has had such historical weight, was gorgeous and much more. I love the Beatrice Potter books, but much more elevated than than like that in some ways. And so but I noticed sort of, and that's sort of for a publication that's reaching a broader audience, but even for small art magazines that are sort of art writers writing for other art writers, I felt similarly that maybe even, when I wrote my first feature for Art in America, that there were certain edits that I would get that would be meant to tone down my critical interpretation of like art institutions in general, the media and how they portray Native artists, what the point of the artist's work was, how truly critical it is of the kind of US as it exists today and the art world. So I think even just writing my first feature on Tyrell Tapaha, a gay Navajo weaver for Art in America back in 2024, I realized there's like a very sort of softened version of a Native artist that people are able to palette. And I've tried to not let that hold me back. I found it really jarring at first, but I realized like the constructive thing I can do here is to continue to elevate, and amplify these artists to, a broader audience, and like getting mired in the details would just be, and being discouraged from writing at all would be not the point.
As a Lakota writer working across media and institutions, how do you decide which stories need to be told right now?
I don't have as much control as I would like as far as what needs to be told. I'm often sort of left feeling like I'm gaslit by media, by editors about what's important, how that's happening in Indian country, certainly in the art world. So sometimes I really spend so much time pitching countless different types of ideas at different angles, different, formats of writing. And so it's difficult to say how to prioritize. Unfortunately, I think I have been just to maximize the amount of exposure I can. I do sort of think through the editor's lens of like what will get clicks. And so whether I think something, that click-worthy, clickbaity sort of story is like the most important, it becomes a little bit less relevant, unfortunately. But I have spent, sometimes like 12 hours a day for a whole week, pitching stories without getting one placement. So I've had to learn from, that how to focus my time, I guess.
Right. As you say, keep throwing gum at the wall till it sticks.
Yeah.
But from your perspective, what does mainstream media consistently get wrong about Native artists and cultural production?
Well, they're constantly measuring authenticity. I think that's a pretty commonly known fact in our community.
Right.
And so when a Native artist is making art of any kind, whether it's gesturing to history or tradition or not, it's still Native art. It's still art from that particular person's drive, that particular experience. And so I think that people need perhaps to focus less on like what their preconceived ideas are of like authenticity, but also Native institutions, art institutions are a bit complicit in that problem too, for their own
Very true.
self-protection.
Both me and Joe were in Santa Fe last year doing this show and speaking to some artists, and it was dumbfounding to learn from artists that, collectors look at their art and say, well, it's not Native enough. I created it, how can it not be Native enough? And I think there is that mentality still. It doesn't fit within their perspective or their narrative of what Native art's supposed to look like. So it's how we drive that and continue to drive that in writing, in production, in, our storytelling and our narrative from our own words.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I feel lucky in a way being from I would say that there's basically two big focuses, in terms of like interest in Native art. It's art from the Southwest and Plains Native art. And my family is Lakota and Dakota, so I guess we sort of won on that front. But I don't think that actually should be sort of the two broad strokes that we all have to fall under. And so I'm hoping through sort of, I feel like some of my writing has had to be a little bit skewed more positively, but now that I have a number my byline has become more expansive. I do want to be a little bit more critical and put more opinion pieces out about, how institutions and individuals in and outside of, Europe or Indian country are like contributing to this very narrow lens with which or through which we look at Native art.
Mm-hmm.
What stories about Indigenous artists are rarely covered? Why do you think that gap or those gaps exist?
Why are they rarely covered? There's something about just being a Native person that is inherently confrontational to a non-Native person, especially a white person, but like also other types of non-Native people who live on this land. And so I think that level of like discomfort and is sort of the baseline. And then you add on like, an artist like Dimin Dineyazi, who's a transdisciplinary Diné artist who has posted on social media like, no fucking way would I ever write an opinion piece when solicited for the New York Times. That's a colonial institution and they're trash. So you add on like someone who's very outspoken and people are just, I don't know. I think it particularly now, there's not as much of a appetite among like a non-native audience to be engaged in this sort of self-effacing dynamic with underrepresented communities. I think everyone is a little bit on the defense at this point, feeling like they took the lessons in and now they're just sort of sated. So I think that there's a fear of confrontation, a fear of discomfort. And so you see that translating to artists who are more educational, more positivist, doing really well. You see Jeffrey Gibson, who's like a master at storytelling, and engaging audiences of like with no exposure to Native art and really communicating effectively and succinctly like what he wants to say. And I think that serves its purpose, and so does Demian's work. But I do feel, just out of personally being like more exhausted of like the educational piece and also the confrontational piece, that the educational piece somehow feels a little bit less tiresome, and so I feel like works like Jeffrey's, or when he speaks about Native art, or works like Anna Tsoulourakis, who does these sort of public interventions through text-based pieces that are like billboard size, things that are very like direct, that do a lot of the didactics on their own, are really helpful. And I think institutions are interested in that. Museums thinking of themselves as teaching organizations to an extent. I mean, that's certainly part of their definition for certain grant purposes. And I think artists who, are not creating such conceptual work, or the work itself is speaking for itself pretty clearly, how gets traction. And so I think, if that answers your question.
Well, going back to what I was saying, the perception of what is Native American art and the non-natives look at that. So how does media framing shape the art market's perception of what Native art is supposed to look like? They're driving the force, and they're kind of driving the collectors and saying, this is Native art, this isn't, even though it is.
They are certainly focused on work that has some reference to, tradition or history. And so I think that's, if there's a way that we can de-emphasize that, I think that's critically important, as we, don't want to carry the burden of representation constantly. It's a big weight. So I think media companies really need to look critically at like their definition of what is Native American art, and just make it more simple. Like if you're a Native self-identified artist and you have a reciprocal relationship with your community, that community claim accepts you, like you're a Native artist, and if your work should be evaluated based on like your craftsmanship, not whether like it reflects history.
True.
Yeah, I think that sort of walks into the next question about what the responsibility is for writers, editors, culture critics when covering Native artists.
Yeah, I've been uh, really pleasantly surprised, and also a little bit dubious to find that there are art magazines that are very interested in Native art, and there's been just a lot of display of Native art in museums and galleries. Not as much acquisition, and that's a major problem. Um, and when there are major acquisitions, say like at Crystal Bridges Museum, what is the impetus for that? It's a museum founded and still owned by the Waltons, who have just come up for kind of environmental review. There was a piece of legislation, I forget the exact name of it, but that basically requires companies to disclose their a kind of sustainability report, like what is an evaluation of their impact on the environments where they operate. And I don't think it's beyond belief that that acquisition is meant to sort of align themselves with an indigenous community, with the land, to say, like, in this sort of symbolic gesture, like, oh, we care about the land, which also, when you think about it, is sort of pretty offensive. It sort of does that historical thing of conflating Native people with nature in a way, and like if you support a native artist, somehow that gives you like de facto the credibility as like a advocate for environmentalism and sustainability, and so we're not all one thing. And so I think other organizations, institutions, magazines are similarly trying to patch up their credibility. They might realize like also the um native artists, it's almost like this, so there's like what 577 federally recognized tribes. It's as if the art world just discovered there's 577, France, Italy, Germany, England,
Right.
in their backyard, and they're like, wow, there's all this art we'd never taken seriously before, and it's amazing. And how and these people are just going to take crumbs and make a meal out of it, which is what so many native arts are forced to do. And I think these institutions are definitely banking on native arts willingness to participate in like this what is still an extractive relationship. And there are publications like Hyperallergic, I do think, do a really consistent job of writing about Indigenous art. I think Art News is doing an improved job. They have some Latino editors who are more focused on like Indigenous art in general. I think there are, sort of warriors within these organizations. I'm forgetting the curator at the Brooklyn Museum, who is Yurok. She's actually the sister of a friend of mine. There's people who I think are like rising through these ranks. Shandine Brown was a PhD at Yale, who did a show at the Hudson River Museum. I think there are like natural allies and people in our community who are working their way up to increase this, visibility, hopefully in a more codified way. But there's still like outliers.
True. Well, there's often tension placed on Native artists between preserving tradition and making contemporary work. Why do you think this binary still exists? Is it driven by the narrative that the museums, the institutions, or the collectors?
I think similar to what I said is it continues to be true, is that we're sort of culpable as a community to an extent. We believe in perpetuating tradition, and certainly there's like a push from elders to do that, sometimes in even more intensely than younger generations. But I've also talked to artists who said their elders have said, like, go tell our community stories, like do it in the way that you feel is right for your lens, how you want to express yourself. And I think that's a more adaptive strategy. So I think that is happening. I think institutions are continuing to look for work that registers as authentically native. You look at the Met and their the Dykeman collection that's sequestered in a little corner next to the American wing. It's not integrated into the American wing as it should be. Why is George Morrison's landscapes? Why are they not hanging alongside its peers. That doesn't make any sense to me. And so even just within like these institutions, there's pretty divergent perspectives on how to display native art, what like contemporary native art looks like. I don't think that people would necessarily automatically register that George Morrison's abstractions and landscape paintings are necessarily native art. And so in that way, they almost be more of a natural, more easily integrated into that broader American wing. But there's only one Indigenous curator at the Met, and then everyone else has their own little fiefdoms. And so it's beyond a doubt true that there are folks responsible for the American wing that are denying the entry of native art into their space. And I think that's sort of unfortunate. But the institutions definitely have a role to play too. So I think we can't necessarily lay blame on like one or the other. It's for better or worse, not so black and white.
Yeah. So, I guess that kind of leads to this question about who benefits from the idea that native art must remain traditional to be considered authentic.
It's also kind of a complicated question. I think of a lot about trying to write about art from tribes in the Northeast. There are a number of artists who are pretty vocal, like say in Massachusetts, about their use of wampum in their work, and so they are recognized. A number of Massachusetts-based artists were just included in an ancillary show to one at the Bell Gallery, curated by the recently terminated curators there. And so I think in their traditional material choices, they sort of gain recognition for like that choice. And that individuates them from the contemporary artist who's in the main show at the Bell. They sort of create their own lane. But if the question were like, are they going to be acquired by the Natural History Museum or the Met? It's going to be the Natural History Museum, a museum that famously displays Native people in a historical past that's kind of exhausting to look at. So I think, it's not like it's just institutions or it's just Native people benefiting or losing. I think. But then, I think that we are also losing when maybe there's someone else who wants to focus on abstraction, and they're not able to today because there's an emphasis on registering, native art in this sort of traditional way.
Right.
And I think that there's certainly those conversations do happen. It's not something, unfortunately, as a writer, that I think artists or curators or institutions are very eager to share. I found myself definitely as a writer met with a lot of fear about what I might expose in a story. So I don't get all the juicy details, but I'm trying to get more of them.
Investigative reporting.
Yeah, the art writing turns into an investigation for sure.
Yeah. Well, we're seeing museums open or rebrand Native-focused galleries. What feels promising about this movement, and what still concerns you and your thoughts about it?
So a really great recent example was the vamping of the sort of a native wing at the Natural History Museum. I actually went over the summer and met with a group of artists from kind of the Alaska and like the western coast of Canada, who were all included in this show, and they worked across a number of mediums. They were actually mostly digital, sort of like video installations there. What I thought was really powerful about that, just like fundamentally, was that it was artists from that entire sort of coastline community, which sort of dismantled the whole idea of like it needing to be a show about where borders defines it in any way. I thought like,
Right.
I was asking like, oh, are you from Alaska or are you from Canada, and that didn't matter. What mattered was like their tribe and like what region they live in and how they live in relation to one another, and also the ways that these artists were like representing their particular design disciplines was interesting to me, and the stories from their community, they were really focused on intellectual property, and so in order to kind of tell their stories, they got buy-in from their community, so that they didn't risk I guess feeling or being accused of selling out or like kind of peddling their community's culture for consumption. So their organizations basically function so that like community members also benefit financially from the sale of their projects to a certain extent for a certain period of time, as do they, like the actual artists themselves. So I think that's I don't know that was necessarily like a reason for the Natural History Museum sort of deciding to work with them, but I also think it's possible that it was. They seem to be operating at a pretty sophisticated level. I think intellectual property is at least something that's an expanding area of consideration for Native artists after Urban Outfitters versus Navajo Nation. In the 2016 case, the Navajo Nation won, which was one of the only cases that successfully invoked the Indian Arts and Crafts Act of 1984, which is sorely underused. So all it took was like the wealthiest Native nation in the U.S. to make that work. But I think that's an important kind of precedent that set, up this, this set of artists thinking more critically about like how to use institutions, how to use the law in a way that protects them and advances their, communities' storytelling and traditions and contemporary interpretations of that.
So, you spoke about museum archives as both resources and sites of harm. Can you unpack that tension?
That's such a personal question. For me, I think about like wanting to learn Lakota growing up in rural Northern California and knowing that UC Berkeley had the largest archive of Lakota like artifacts and language records of any institution in the United States, and a place that's only 3 hours drive from where I grew up. My dad lives like 30 minutes from there in the Bay Area as well, and so I think like on the one hand, you wonder like where would these artifacts be today? Would they have been destroyed with a development of like the land where they were excavated from, or and so in that way it's like maybe they're saved, but also like there's not enough of an expedient conversation about like the return of these objects to that had no say in where they went in the first place. So I think they're helping to some extent, but they're also hurting in the sense that like there are the Met and the Natural History Museum have huge archives of Navajo weavings, for example. I've met like artists like Terrell Tapa, who's through a Bard graduate school's kind of interest in his work, been able to access some of those archives and literally knows the stories of the people who've made these weavings and can sort of fill in the gaps in narratives around like what Navajo weaving even looks like. We've probably seen the industrial version of that. That's what you can find at like these, online or at outposts throughout the Southwest. But there's actually so much more creativity beyond this standardized idea of like what is appealing about Navajo weaving, and a lot of that is just contained in these archives. And so I think it hurts for that not to be done, invested in, to not have like a position at the museum, one of the museums, or the Bard Graduate School, like that someone like Tyrell or community folks could occupy long term, or engage them as consultants in a meaningful way, with pay that's worth their time. So I think that what hurts is that these institutions are sort of recognizing the problem. They do pay a lot of lip service, but they don't invest in doing the work of displaying these pieces and these artifacts in a meaningful way in consultation with community members. And they shouldn't have say whether these works are returned to tribes or whether they should continue to be kept in the archive or displayed. They should be deferring to communities. And I think that's what NAGPRA sort of requires. Unfortunately, that has been one of the slowest acts to ever be enabled, I think, in the US. I don't understand fully why the pace is so glacial, but there are people doing the work, I think, very slowly and incrementally to have a dialogue around that.
What does return truly mean beyond the physical object to communities and future generations?
What does return truly mean? I think it's beyond important. So many communities are, living in places like either on reservations or urban communities, 60 to 70%, without access to these kind of signifiers of our cultural legacy. And I think that and it's data, it's information, it's things that we can't access, especially if you're maybe perhaps especially if you're like living in an urban Indian, pan-Indian community. You have even less access to this, potentially to elders, to learning about things that would have been passed on to you had you not had this kind of divide. So I think return is kind of a real big part of repair. And I don't really, certainly I think that it would be really wonderful to see a hybrid approach of like return, but also documentation happening at the same time, with kind of digital access, a centralized like access for members of these 577 distinct communities to connect with our history and language and culture, because again, so many of us are displaced and don't have really ways to connect with this. We might not be going back to our reservation where these objects might be returned to, and so to be able to connect without that burden, I think is the onus is on these institutions to provide those kinds of points of access and resources.
That reminds me of Ben, not Ben, his father,
Ben West.
Ben West, his father. His father's Dick West from Bacone. Rick West, the first director of the NMAI out of DC. His concept was the fourth museum. A place where the museums could take digital versions of these items to communities that aren't in DC, which I think is a beautiful concept. Maybe there's a place for that in sort of this larger picture.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, any good idea I think we have about how to tell our community stories, it's like there's surely another Native person who's had that thought. So
Right.
I think that if we can find each other and find these shared like passions and interests, like that's half the battle. We're so disparate. And I think, yeah, having some kind of digital, fourth museum sounds incredible, and maybe something you could access, coalitionally across museums. Maybe you don't have to go to the National Museum of the American Indian. You can just go to your local museum, and there's, a computer and some headphones, and you can go explore or whatever. And maybe you don't even have to be a Native person to access this. I mean, there could be some kind of protocols developed around that for that are culturally sensitive, obviously. So I think that would be really incredible. I think that there's certainly a lot of room for like innovators and Native people in the tech industry to to innovate something like this. And I'm sure there's some freak in Silicon Valley who loves Native culture, who wants to invest a bunch of money into a project like this. We just have to find out who that person is.
Seek and find. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, besides institutions and other means of Native storytelling that are out there, another aspect is obviously the art market. How do you see the art market evolving its relationship to artists, and where does it still fall short? Because a lot of those are driven by institutions.
Right. I think the art market needs to work on kind of paying native artists appropriately for their work. I've talked to a number of artists who are actually more interested in selling their work to museums than they are like through the gallery system in the art kind of market, because they're giving 50% of the sale to the gallery in the case of the gallery sale, whereas like they're keeping whatever the museum is paying them, typically if they don't have an agent or not working with some kind of dealer or middleman of some sort. So I think that the art market, certainly from what I've noticed, and given that there's been, I think, a lot of speculation around how like emerging artists are able to skip several tiers of the process in their career growth and able to like, you know, get sums in their individual sales that are well beyond their years of experience. I feel like native artists tend to be lagging in that area, and I think that there's probably structural issues around that. I think that part of it might have to do with there being emerging native artists who are, again, like not producing work that looks like traditional, and so something that looks more traditional might be seen as more valuable because it's, by the non-native person's measure, like more authentic, and therefore seemingly more rare. But again, I think I think the art market has a responsibility to also like diffuse native art across, galleries that aren't just focused on Native American artists. There are a few galleries in New York that are very focused on Native artists, Garth Greenan, Sean Kelly, and others. And I don't think you need to be like specialized in Native art or have like a special interest in Native art to like to represent Native artists and to command like prices that other emerging artists are able to in an art market. I think that also the sort of like the marketing of Native artists would have to change too. Again, like similar to sort of the Met and the sequestering of Native art in its own like collection space next to American art. When people are writing about art that's selling or art that's exciting, it could just be, a piece of art made by this artist. It doesn't have to suddenly fall into this like specialized or fetishized like native art kind of profile. And it's like the double-edged sword of like that sort of thing. Like if you're writing a story, like I did like 25 Native American artists you should know this Native American heritage about for art news. Like the flip side of that is that we should be able to talk about these artists year round, and they should be included in other roundups of just artists who, are getting attention for their work.
Or the it factor, yeah.
Yeah, so it's sort of like you're damned if you you're damned if you don't, I guess. But
right.
Yeah, it would also be nice for art markets to kind of take more seriously places like Santa Fe Indian Market. I think that it's only sort of people who go to Santa Fe Indian Market who who are already sort of in the know that understand that it's, I believe, the second largest art market in the US next to Art Basel, which, most people who go to all these other art markets in New York and Miami haven't, and in Europe and Asia don't really know this. And they're sort of missing out on, our biggest secret that everybody knows. So I think there's probably some responsibility in the market to take native art more seriously, to not relegate it to the category of design or craft. And so I think I'm not exactly sure like how those connections are made. I guess I would have to sort of think more about that. But one of the most obvious things you could do, obviously, from these like from the art market side, from the fair side, is to hire like native staff to make sure that you have, people going to Santa Fe Indian Market and connecting those artists to galleries that would end up in these markets outside of Santa Fe. And at this point, there's such a strong interest and so much money going into Santa Fe Indian Market that might not even be necessary. But I think that would be an interesting intermediary step for people who just are not thinking about quote unquote Native American art, or don't know how to think about Native artists within like the broader scope of what art is.
So how can Native artists protect their agency while navigating both institutional and market, or how am I trying to say, while navigating the institutional and market pressures?
How can they protect themselves while navigating these pressures in the market and institutions? Yeah, I think sort of circling back to what those artists were doing, that Tlingit and other artists who are in this kind of revamped Native art section at the Natural History Museum. I think thinking about having just like ironclad intellectual property agreements that you write up in conjunction with your community and that you have signed by these museums. I mean, I think that that's an important way to protect your work. I think Native artists need to be looking at contracts in general. I'm sure there's plenty of Native artists who are not, working with a museum, a gallery, individual who are not writing up every sale, in a contract. They might be getting Venmo'd or something. And who knows, maybe this collector is a high, net worth individual, and they buy your work and it's suddenly worth exponentially more than what this artist sold the work to the collector for, and they're not profiting from that increase in value at all. So having a contract that articulates, some kind of residual payment for the increased value would be critical in that sense, or in that kind of situation. I think also when you're dealing with like digital art, something that's so easily downloaded and replicated, to have like intellectual property, limiting the access to that work after a certain period of time. So if someone, for whatever reason downloads or gets a copy of your work, you have the legal right to sue them for illegally having access to your work.
True.
So those, I think, are two ways that I think would be important. And there's certainly not a lot of education about that. Most of the artists I talk to do not spend a lot of time talking about contracts and intellectual property rights. But I think that that's important.
Absolutely. Well, looking ahead, what gives you hope when you look at the next generation of Native artists, writers, and cultural workers?
What gives me hope? Really, joyful, outspoken artists. I think of Rachel Martin, who is Tlingit and makes works that are sort of irreverent, feminist, like art, figurative work of women, very kind of physical imagery, that just sort of points to tradition, but also like doesn't take itself too seriously. I think of Demian Diniaze and Maria, Anna Tularakis, who make sort of print work that you couldn't misinterpret. I mean, it's literally written out for you. I think works that are, what's exciting to me are works that are like just really underscoring that like phrase, a picture's worth 1,000 words. Works that really just are communicating effectively something kind of funny about like the contradictions of being like a Native person in US society. Those kinds of works are really exciting to me because we have to experience all of those contradictions, I think, so often in silence or without really enough recognition, or we're laughing amongst ourselves, but we're not really laughing with our audience. I'm excited by artists who are kind of including people in the joke.
Mm-hmm.
If you could rewrite the rules of engagement between Native artists and institutions, what would you change first?
Contracts. Yeah, I think that you need a lawyer present from the jump, or do your own research. I think that there also has to be native staff at any institution that you're working with, because they're responsible for some kind of curator, some kind of archivist, someone who's making sure that your work is being displayed properly, that it's being archived properly, that it's not being sequestered into or segregated into a native art section. Someone who's really thinking really closely about that kind of careful curation. So I think those would be kind of the maybe baseline two requirements. I also think like maybe the third thing is like more data-driven sales processes. Like what are artists like at a particular place in their careers actually getting for any given work, for like the amount of time and thought and like craftsmanship put in. I think again, like there's so many native artists who are making a meal out of crumbs, and a more data-driven conversation takes desperation out of the interaction.
Mm-hmm. Well, Petala, as we wrap up, what's next for you? What else do you have going on, and what does the future hold?
Yeah. So I'm sort of just figuring out some final details on a book with Tashin. So I'm really excited about that. It should be coming out later this year. It's called Hidden Figures, the underrepresented artists of California and the Northeast. So kind of looking at like some of those Massachusetts artists and other folks like who are maybe doing contemporary work but are under recognized because their work doesn't fall into the Plains or Southwest design emphases. So excited to kind of like uncover and amplify some of those folks in a book. Who doesn't love a coffee table book? I think I want to see more native art coffee table books.
Absolutely.
Oh, that sounds exciting. Yeah, I feel like there's a gap in my knowledge of California native artists and also East Coast artists, and so yeah, something like this I really look forward to.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm from California and I've now live in the Northeast, so maybe it's a little bit self-centered of me to think about these just two places in that way. But I do feel like these are first contact tribal communities, and so they're that much more erased from the conversation. So I do think that there's something there, and that's why Tashin is interested.
Well, continue on your work, on your voice, and exposing those that don't have a voice or are more humbled to share their stories. What you do is a great addition to the Native American art world and to Indigenous people. So thank you for coming on the show today. We appreciate your time.
Thank you both too. I mean, I can say the same to you. It's been like watching your podcast, because I love the visual, is like talking to friends, really. I know so many of the people you've kind of brought to your audience. So shout out to Roger Kuhn in particular. I love that interview.
It's been a pleasure. We do it because we love it and it's a passion and we like being a part of it. And again, telling our story from our narrative and the people that it should be heard from. So again, thank you for your time and much continued success. And I look forward to seeing your book come out.
Thank you. Yeah, same to you.
Petala Ironcloud reminds us that representation is never neutral. It is shaped by power, language, and intent. Through his writing and advocacy, he asks us to question what is visible, what is omitted, and why. This conversation is not just about art, it's about responsibility, authorship, and imagining a future where Indigenous voices define their own narratives. This is Beyond the Art.